My name is Theodore Marsh, and I am 78 years old. 5 weeks ago, I experienced what I initially believed was a heart attack, alone in my house on a Sunday evening, and I called my son, Andrew, 3 separate times within the span of 20 minutes. My hands shaking so badly, I could barely hold the phone steady enough to dial. He didn't answer any of those calls. He was on a beach in Cabo San Lucas with his wife and her extended family, celebrating what I later learned was his mother-in-law's 60th birthday, and his phone, he explained afterward, had been sitting in a hotel room charger while the group spent the evening at a beachside restaurant with poor cell coverage. I ended up calling an ambulance myself, alone, and spent that night in an emergency room being told, eventually, that what I'd experienced was a severe panic attack rather than a cardiac event. Though the doctors made clear that at my age, with my specific health history, it had been entirely reasonable and necessary to treat it as a genuine cardiac emergency until they could rule that out definitively. 5 days after that terrifying night, Andrew called me, his voice tight with a different kind of panic entirely, needing access to a significant portion of my retirement savings to keep his struggling business from collapsing. If you've ever needed someone desperately, in the middle of genuine fear, and found only silence where their voice should have been, stay with me. Because this story isn't about refusing my son the help he eventually asked for. It's about what happens when you have to decide, in the raw aftermath of being badly let down, whether love still requires showing up for someone even after they failed to show up for you. I need to tell you who I was before I tell you about that Sunday evening, because otherwise the rest of this story won't carry its proper weight. I spent 39 years working as an accountant, the last 22 of them running my own small practice outside of Portland, Oregon, serving primarily small business owners and families throughout the region who needed careful, trustworthy financial guidance without the overhead of a large firm. It was steady, unglamorous work, built almost entirely on relationships and reputation rather than flashy marketing, the kind of career that produces genuine financial security over decades rather than any single dramatic windfall. I built that practice slowly, one client relationship at a time, developing a reputation for careful, conservative financial guidance that occasionally frustrated clients hoping for more aggressive strategies, but that consistently protected the people who trusted me with their family's financial futures over the long run. I retired at 71, selling my practice to a younger accountant who'd worked alongside me for the final 8 years, and settled into a comfortable, if occasionally lonely, retirement in the same modest house I'd lived in for over 3 decades, the house where Andrew grew up, where Nancy and I raised him together before circumstances left me to navigate the second half of my life alone. My wife Nancy and I raised one son, Andrew, in that house, and I lost Nancy 11 years ago to a sudden aneurysm that gave us absolutely no warning, no chance to prepare, no final conversations of the kind that illness at least sometimes allows. She was gone within hours of her first complaint of a severe headache, and the abruptness of that loss has shaped, I think, a particular kind of anxiety I've carried ever since about sudden, unexpected medical crises. An anxiety that would prove directly relevant to what happened 5 weeks ago. Nancy had always been the more instinctively nurturing parent between the two of us, the one who noticed immediately when Andrew was struggling with something, even before he'd found words for it himself, the one who somehow always seemed to be exactly where she was needed at exactly the right moment. I've often wondered, in the years since losing her, whether Andrew's own instincts around presence and attentiveness might have developed differently, more fully, had he had more years to absorb that particular quality of hers before she was gone. Andrew was 35 when Nancy died, already married to Vanessa, already a father to young Ryan, and I remember watching him navigate that loss with a kind of stoic efficiency that worried me even at the time, a tendency to manage his own grief quickly and privately, rather than sitting with it openly. Perhaps not so different from patterns I recognize in my own approach to difficult emotions. We've never talked in much depth, even in the 11 years since, about how losing his mother so suddenly shaped his own relationship with vulnerability and emergency, though I sometimes wonder whether some of what happened 5 weeks ago traces back, in ways neither of us has fully examined, to that earlier loss, and how we both, in our own ways, learned to compartmentalize crisis rather than fully inhabit it. Andrew is 46 now, married to his wife Vanessa for 14 years, with 2 teenage children, my grandchildren, Ryan and Ella. Andrew followed a considerably different career path than my own methodical accounting work, starting a boutique fitness equipment company 8 years ago that manufactures and sells specialized training equipment to gyms and serious home fitness enthusiasts. The business has had real ups and downs over its 8 years, periods of genuine promise followed by periods of considerable financial strain, a roller coaster that I've watched Andrew navigate with a mixture of admiration for his entrepreneurial courage and quiet, persistent worry about the financial risks he's continually willing to take on. I want to be fair to Andrew from the outset, because it would be easy to paint him simply as neglectful, and that isn't the complete picture of who he actually is. He's been, in most respects, a loving son and devoted father, someone who calls regularly, who includes me thoughtfully in family gatherings, who has genuinely tried, over the years since Nancy's death, to make sure I don't feel isolated in my retirement. What happened 5 weeks ago represents, I believe, a specific failure in a specific moment rather than a fundamental character flaw, though the specific failure itself carried consequences serious enough that I don't think it can simply be waved away as an understandable oversight either. About 6 weeks ago, Andrew and Vanessa traveled to Cabo San Lucas for what was described to me as a 5-day family trip celebrating Vanessa's mother's 60th birthday, an event Vanessa's extended family had been planning for the better part of a year, involving roughly 20 family members staying at a resort property along the coast. Andrew mentioned the trip to me several weeks in advance, and I recall feeling genuinely pleased for him, understanding how important these kinds of extended family milestones can be, and having no particular concerns about the timing, since nothing in my own health or circumstances suggested any reason for worry. I want to tell you about that Sunday evening carefully, because the specific details matter enormously to understanding both my own terror in that moment and the particular weight of Andrew's absence from it. I had eaten dinner alone, as I typically do, a simple meal of grilled chicken and vegetables that I remember distinctly because I keep returning to it in my mind, trying to identify whether anything unusual had preceded what followed. I'd settled into my usual evening routine afterward, reading in my armchair with the local news playing quietly on the television, when, around 8 o'clock, I began experiencing a sudden, alarming tightness in my chest, accompanied by shortness of breath and a racing heartbeat that felt, in that terrifying moment, exactly like every warning sign I'd ever read about regarding cardiac emergencies. Given my age, given a family history that includes my own father's fatal heart attack at 68, and given the sudden, frightening nature of the symptoms, I did what felt like the only reasonable thing in that moment. I reached for my phone and called my son. My hands, I remember distinctly, were already shaking badly enough that I fumbled the phone screen twice before successfully dialing his number, a detail that has stayed with me vividly in the weeks since, that particular physical manifestation of fear compounding whatever the underlying medical symptoms actually were. The call went to voicemail. I tried again 2 minutes later, my hands now shaking even more, my breathing becoming increasingly labored in a way that, looking back, I now understand was likely as much anxiety as any underlying physical symptom, though in that moment, the distinction felt entirely academic and irrelevant to my genuine terror. Voicemail again. I sat on my living room floor, having lowered myself there instinctively, some old first aid instinct telling me to avoid standing while experiencing chest pain, my back against the base of my armchair, staring at my phone screen and willing it to show Andrew's name calling back. I tried a third time, perhaps 8 minutes after my first attempt, my breathing now genuinely labored, real panic beginning to compound whatever the original physical symptoms actually were. Each unanswered ring feeling like it stretched on considerably longer than it actually did. Voicemail a third time. I want to be honest about what those unanswered calls felt like. In that specific, frightening moment, alone on my living room floor, genuinely uncertain whether I was dying. It wasn't simply disappointment. It was a very specific, very acute terror, the realization that the person I'd instinctively reached for in what felt like a life-threatening emergency was entirely unreachable, and that whatever happened next, I would need to manage it completely alone. I called 911 myself, my voice, according to the dispatcher who later described the call back to me during a follow-up conversation, remarkably steady given what I was experiencing, though I have almost no memory of that steadiness myself, only the raw fear underlying it. Paramedics arrived within 12 minutes, and I spent the following several hours in the emergency room at Providence Portland Medical Center, undergoing an EKG, blood work, and careful monitoring before the attending physician finally explained, sometime after midnight, that my heart itself showed no signs of acute distress, and that what I'd experienced was most likely a severe panic attack, though he was careful to emphasize, kindly but firmly, that treating it as a potential cardiac emergency had been entirely the correct decision, given my age and family history, regardless of the eventual diagnosis. I called Andrew again around 10 o'clock that evening, from a hospital bed, once the initial crisis had stabilized enough for me to think clearly. This time, he answered, and I heard, in the background, the unmistakable sounds of a beachside restaurant, laughter and music, and the particular ambient noise of a large family celebration in full swing. "Dad?" he said, his voice immediately shifting into concern once he registered where I was calling from. "What's wrong? Where are you?" I explained, as calmly as I could manage, what had happened. The chest pain, the 3 unanswered calls, calling the ambulance myself, the hours in the emergency room, the eventual diagnosis of a panic attack rather than a cardiac event. I could hear him processing this information in real time, his voice shifting from confusion to alarm to what sounded like genuine, mounting guilt. "Dad, I am so sorry. My phone was charging back at the hotel room. We were at dinner with Vanessa's whole family. I had no idea. I would have left immediately if I'd known you were trying to reach me. Are you okay? Do you need me to fly back tonight?" I told him honestly that the immediate crisis had passed, that I was being kept for overnight observation but expected to be discharged the following morning, and that flying back immediately, given the significant cost and disruption to a trip his wife's family had planned for nearly a year, probably wasn't necessary given the resolution of the acute situation. I want to be honest that some part of me, even in that moment, was managing his guilt as much as processing my own fear, a pattern I recognize now as something I've done throughout much of my relationship with Andrew, prioritizing his comfort over fully expressing my own needs. Andrew called several more times over the following days, checking in appropriately, expressing continued concern and apology, but he did not in fact cut the trip short, completing the remaining 4 days in Cabo as originally planned before flying home on schedule. I understood, intellectually, the reasoning. The acute crisis had passed, I was safely stable, and disrupting a significant family milestone trip after the fact wouldn't have changed anything about what had already happened. But emotionally, I found myself sitting with a persistent, quiet hurt in the days that followed, a sense that even after learning the full details of what I'd experienced alone on that living room floor, Andrew's calculation had still landed on completing the vacation, rather than returning immediately to be physically present with me during my recovery from what had genuinely felt, in the moment, like a life-threatening emergency. I didn't confront him directly about this in the days immediately following his return. I told myself the acute crisis had resolved safely, that dwelling on what couldn't be changed served no productive purpose, and that raising the issue might simply create unnecessary tension in our relationship over something that, from a strictly practical standpoint, hadn't actually resulted in lasting harm. I recognize now, with some distance, that this reasoning, while understandable, also allowed me to avoid a difficult but probably necessary conversation, the same way I suspect many parents avoid naming disappointments with their adult children in the name of preserving harmony. 5 days after Andrew's return from Cabo, on a Friday evening, my phone rang. It was Andrew, and I could hear immediately, in the tight, controlled quality of his voice, that something serious was unfolding on his end. a very different kind of urgency than the vacation check-ins of the preceding week. "Dad," he said, "I need to talk to you about something important, and I know the timing is difficult given everything that just happened, but I don't know where else to turn." He explained, over the following half hour, that his fitness equipment business was facing an acute cash flow crisis, triggered by a combination of a delayed shipment from his primary overseas manufacturer and an unexpected default from one of his largest wholesale clients, a gym chain that had filed for bankruptcy protection, leaving Andrew's company holding a significant amount of unpaid invoices. He walked me through the specific numbers with the careful, slightly rehearsed precision of someone who had clearly spent the preceding several sleepless nights running and rerunning the calculations, hoping each time for some overlooked solution that never quite materialized. Without an infusion of capital within the next 2 to 3 weeks, he faced the genuine possibility of having to lay off most of his small staff and potentially close the business entirely. A business he'd spent 8 years building from nothing, starting in his own garage before eventually moving into the modest warehouse space he currently leased. "I need access to somewhere between $80,000 and $100,000, he said, "just to bridge us through the next several months while we secure alternative financing and replace the lost revenue from that client. Dad, I know how much you have saved. I know it's meant to be your retirement security, and I hate even asking you this, especially given how badly I let you down 5 days ago. But I don't have anywhere else to turn. The bank won't extend additional credit given our current cash position, and I've exhausted every other option I can think of." His voice cracked slightly on that last sentence, and I could hear, underneath the careful preparation, genuine fear about what losing 8 years of work would actually mean, not just financially but for his own sense of who he'd become as a man who had built something real from nothing. I sat with that request for a long moment, the specific, sharp irony of the timing settling into my chest with an almost physical weight. 5 days after I'd called my son 3 times during what felt like a genuine life-threatening emergency, receiving only silence in response, he was now asking me to place a significant portion of my own financial security behind saving his business. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment. My first instinct was not entirely generous. Part of me wanted to point out, directly and without softening, exactly what those unanswered calls had felt like. Alone on my living room floor, genuinely uncertain whether I was dying, while he sat at a beachside dinner with his phone charging, unreachable, in a hotel room. Part of me wanted to simply say no, to let him understand, in the clearest possible terms, that presence during genuine emergencies isn't optional, that showing up when someone might be dying matters more than any celebration, however significant, and that consequences ought to follow choices like the one he'd made. But I thought of Nancy, and the particular way she always approached difficult moments with our son, with honesty, always, but never with cruelty, never using her own hurt as a weapon simply because she had leverage in a given moment. And I thought about Ryan and Ella, my grandchildren, who bore no responsibility for their father's choices, but who stood to lose considerable stability if his business collapsed entirely, along with the genuine 8 years of effort and dreams Andrew had invested in building something of his own. "Andrew," I said slowly, "I'm going to think seriously about helping you with this, because what you've built matters, and because your children's stability matters enormously to me. But before we go any further, I need you to actually hear something from me clearly, not as a condition of my help, but because I don't think anyone has said this to you plainly yet, and I think you need to hear it." "Okay," he said quietly, and I could hear him bracing himself for what was coming. "5 days ago," I said, "I called you 3 times within 20 minutes, genuinely believing I might be having a heart attack, alone in this house, with no one else to reach out to. You didn't answer any of those calls because your phone was charging in a hotel room while you were at dinner. I understand that phones sometimes end up away from us, Andrew. I understand that emergencies rarely announce themselves conveniently. But I need you to sit with what that actually felt like, on my end, calling the person I most needed to reach in a moment of genuine terror, and finding only silence, 3 times in a row, before I finally had to call an ambulance myself and manage the entire crisis completely alone. And then, once you did learn what had happened, once you knew I'd spent hours in an emergency room genuinely afraid for my life, you made the decision to finish the remaining 4 days of your trip, rather than returning immediately. I'm not telling you this to punish you or to make this loan conditional on some elaborate apology, but I need you to actually look at that choice clearly, Andrew, not explain it away, before we talk about what I'm willing to do for your business. There was a long, heavy silence on the line, long enough that I began to wonder if the call had dropped. "You're right," Andrew finally said, his voice breaking in a way I rarely heard from him. "Dad, I've felt sick about this since the moment I learned what actually happened that night. I told myself, in the days since, that because the crisis had resolved safely, my choice not to fly back immediately hadn't really mattered in the end. But that's a convenient story, isn't it? The truth is, I weighed a trip that was important to Vanessa's family against flying back to be physically present with my own father after he'd just faced what felt, to him, like a life-threatening emergency, completely alone. And I chose the trip. I've been telling myself for days that the outcome justified the choice, but the choice itself was wrong regardless of how things turned out. "That's exactly it," I said. "And I want you to understand something important, Andrew. I'm not saying this to hold it over you indefinitely, or to make your business's survival contingent on some perfect display of remorse. I genuinely consider helping regardless of what happened 5 days ago, because your children's stability and everything you've built matter to me, independent of my feelings about that specific night. But I needed you to actually hear this clearly first, because if I simply helped without ever naming what happened, I think you'd walk away from this having learned that showing up during genuine emergencies is optional, since help and forgiveness arrive anyway, regardless of what you prioritize in the moment." "I hear you, Dad," he said, his voice still thick with emotion. "I really do, and I promise you this isn't going to be something I apologize for once, and then quietly move past. I've been thinking about this constantly since I found out what actually happened that night, replaying the decision to stay in Cabo instead of flying home, and I think some part of me has known, without wanting to fully admit it, that I made the wrong call, even before you just said all of this directly. I agreed to seriously consider helping with the business the following week, after Andrew came to my house in person, bringing detailed financial documentation and sitting with me for several hours walking through the specific numbers, the business's genuine prospects for recovery, and the particular structure he was proposing for repaying whatever amount I ultimately provided. He arrived with considerably more transparency and preparation than I'd seen from him in previous conversations about the business's finances over the years, a seriousness that itself signaled how much weight our earlier conversation had carried. We also had, during that visit, a longer, more honest conversation than we'd managed in years about the broader pattern underlying that Sunday evening, about what it actually means, in the concrete, specific moments that test it, to be reliably present for the people who depend on you. Andrew told me during that conversation that he'd actually had a difficult conversation with Vanessa about the whole situation, admitting to her that some part of him had known, standing at that beachside dinner after finally learning what had happened to me, that the right choice was probably to leave immediately, but that he'd let the significance of her mother's milestone birthday, combined with a kind of denial about how serious my situation might have actually been, override that instinct. "I think," he said, sitting across from me at my kitchen table, "I've spent years assuming that because you're generally healthy, generally independent, generally not someone who calls asking for help, that the rare moments you do reach out couldn't really be that urgent. I built a kind of complacency around your resilience, Dad, and that complacency meant I didn't take those 3 unanswered calls as seriously as I should have, even after I learned what they actually represented. I ultimately agreed to provide $85,000 towards stabilizing his business, structured as a formal loan with a clear, modest interest rate and a specific repayment timeline, rather than simply as an unconditional gift, because I wanted the arrangement to carry real accountability alongside genuine support. Andrew accepted those terms without any pushback, seeming to understand and even welcome the structure as appropriate, given everything that had led to the request. In the 5 weeks since, something has genuinely shifted in how Andrew shows up, not just in practical terms, but in the underlying attentiveness behind his presence. He's changed his phone settings, he told me, unprompted, so that calls from me are specifically exempted from any silent or do not disturb settings he has active, regardless of the circumstances, a small but meaningful gesture given what had happened. He's called more frequently since our conversation, not just for logistical updates about the loan repayment, but to actually check in, to ask how I'm sleeping, whether the panic attacks have recurred, whether I've followed up with a cardiologist for additional testing beyond the emergency room's initial assessment, which I have, and which confirmed no underlying cardiac issues requiring ongoing treatment. 2 weeks ago, Andrew visited unannounced on a Tuesday afternoon, something he rarely did given his typically demanding schedule, simply, he explained, because he'd found himself thinking about that Sunday evening and wanted to see me in person rather than just checking in by phone. We spent several hours together that afternoon, working in my garden, a task I'd been putting off given some of the physical limitations that come with age, and he mentioned, toward the end of the visit, that he'd started keeping a small card in his wallet with my address and basic medical information. Just in case, he said, I'm ever somewhere without immediate phone access again, so at least someone else could act quickly if they needed to. Ryan and Ella, my grandchildren, have also started calling me more regularly. A shift I understand, from what Andrew has mentioned, came from a family conversation he had with them about the importance of staying connected to grandparents. A conversation prompted directly by reflecting on how completely unreachable he'd been during a moment I genuinely needed him. Ella, who is 14, sent me a handwritten letter a few weeks ago, something she'd never done before, telling me she'd overheard enough of her parents' conversation to understand roughly what had happened, and wanting me to know that she loved me and that she'd added my number to a special contact list on her own phone that would ring even when her phone was set to silent, a small gesture from a granddaughter that moved me more than I quite know how to express. The business itself has shown genuine signs of stabilizing in the weeks since I provided the loan. Andrew secured 2 new wholesale accounts to help replace the lost revenue from the bankrupt gym chain, and he's made his first 2 loan payments ahead of schedule, a detail he mentioned to me with evident pride during one of our now more frequent phone calls, understanding, I think, the significance of demonstrating reliability to me specifically, given everything that had preceded the arrangement. I don't tell you this story because I want sympathy for an old man whose emergency calls went unanswered. I tell you this story because I want you to understand something important. Being let down by someone you love, even in a moment of genuine crisis, doesn't mean that love itself has failed. It means a specific choice was made, in a specific moment, that fell short of what the moment actually required. Real repair, though, requires naming that shortfall honestly, not simply moving past it in silence, before extending whatever help or forgiveness comes next. Help given without honesty risks teaching the wrong lesson. Honesty given without eventual help risks becoming punishment rather than repair. Both, together, are what actually rebuild trust. I spent one of the most frightening nights of my life alone, my 3 calls to my own son going unanswered, while he celebrated at a beachside dinner thousands of miles away. 5 days later, he needed a significant portion of my life savings to save the business he'd spent 8 years building. I gave him that help, but not before making certain he understood, clearly and honestly, exactly what his absence had cost me, and exactly what kind of presence I needed to see from him going forward, in the moments that matter most. If this story reminded you of someone in your life who struggled to show up when it mattered most, tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight, and consider whether the honest conversation Andrew and I finally had might be one worth having in your own family too, before the next emergency makes that conversation unavoidable.